Yeah, it's this David Arinovich book, Voodoo Histories, and it's an interesting book. It's the guy's a British citizen, and my main complaint about this book was actually the organization of it. The cover of the British version actually makes it really explicit what my problems are. On the cover are pictures of JFK, Marilyn Monroe, The Last Supper, representing like Da Vinci Code type stuff, Princess Diana, and then there's the World Trade Center towers, and I think a picture of Trotsky is on there also. So that kind of gives you an idea of what the flavor of this thing is. It's putting all of these things together which really don't belong with each other. And one thing that I thought was funny about the publisher of this book, the original publisher in England is Jonathan Cape Limited, which is a pretty famous publisher there. They've published in the past T.E. Lawrence, Lawrence of Arabia, and Ian Fleming, who wrote the James Bond books. And very famously, they rejected George Orwell's Animal Farm. So, which kind of, again, gives you the flavor of what this is going to be. And there's kind of two ways to attack political researchers, like, JFK, quote-unquote conspiracy theorists. There's an evidential way, and then there's a kind of like an intellectual way. And this is very much in the second category. This is not a Bugliosi-type book where Bugliosi is trying to go after the evidence. This guy's not that interested in specific evidence. In fact, the very few places where he mentions actual evidence are really ridiculous, and we can maybe talk about that if there's time. What he's mainly trying to get at is that conspiracy theorists they get into groups that are self-confirming. In other words, that people gather together and support one another's quote-unquote fantasies. I think that the government killed JFK, so therefore I join a group where we all believe the same thing, and we all confirm each other, and we never go outside, get out to the outside world, where presumably David Arinovich lives, and so we never find disconfirming evidence. The problem with this type of argument, of course, is that that's going to be the case for any minority position, right? Anybody who's in the majority can say that about any minority group. So if you were like a Southern abolitionist in 1860, I mean, you could have said the same thing, right? You're in this little group, and all you guys, you believe that slavery is wrong, and you're just, confirming each other's theories about what's going on with that. But in fact, you can turn that argument around and say he's in an enormous self-confirming group, which is called the major media, and you can easily discern that by reading all the positive reviews for his book that's out there. I do want to get into one small area of evidence, just to show you the kind of ridiculous nature of the Arinovich book. He talks about the Walker shooting, the case of where Lee Harvey Oswald allegedly took this shot at General Walker prior to the Kennedy assassination. And he says that it is an incontrovertible fact that this happened, which is just absolutely, absurd. And this is actually, just looking at Gerald McKnight's book, Breach of Trust, there's this quote in which he talks about how Walker, who had all this experience in World War II, was stunned when Robert Blakely represented as the bullet fired into his home that had no resemblance to the lead that the police had recovered. And that actually is talked about in Jim's review of Breach of Trust as well. I think you guys have gone over that before, right?
Yeah, that's for sure, right? He's the guy complaining.
Yeah. And so, I mean, it's totally absurd. So Arinovich calls this an incontrovertible fact when Walker himself recognizes that there's no ballistic evidence for this. And then the other big thing that Arinovich trots out kind of in the middle of the book is this thing that he calls the triumph of narrative. And this is kind of interesting. He gets he gets out this biologist who claims that conspiracy theorists have this kind of engine within them that makes them determined to make sense of the world, and they make a continuous story out of these elements that really don't connect with each other. So, we're self-selecting evidence, in other words, and putting them together to form a story. And actually, there is some basis for this. If you look at a book like, for example, there's a book by Daniel Dennett called Consciousness Explained, when he talks about how human beings sometimes make mistakes in thinking that there's something there when really isn't there, because human beings are pattern-seeking animals. So, like, for example, if you're walking down a forest path and you see a wolf and you jump, right? You have the fight or flight response. You see this thing in the forest, and then it turns out not to really be there. It was just the breeze blowing a branch or whatever. Human beings are pattern-seeking animals in that respect, because it's better to react to a false image than it is to miss the wolf entirely when it's real and get eaten. So that they pass on their genes because they get to live, because they don't get eaten by the wolf or whatever. So there is a sort of a germ of truth to that. But the problem is that applies to everything. That would apply to the theory of gravity. That applies to everything in the natural world. So there's no difference between what we do and what science does, as long as there's peer review and as long as there's discernment. And that's what's left out of these arguments that Arinovich is not talking about. There's also other issue besides the kind of what I would say are like epistemological issues. In other words, the questions about how we gain knowledge about the world. You also have to look at there's a string of assassinations. The left is essentially wiped out in this country, and you have to imagine that all of these are individual events with absolutely no connection to each other, despite the fact that it's all of these leftists who are getting murdered. And if you remember, there's this great scene in the movie JFK, which I think was left out of the actual movie. It's the Johnny Carson scene, when Jim Garrison goes on Johnny Carson?
Yeah, right, yeah.
And Garrison says, in that scene, he says, can you imagine what we would have thought if we had been told that the premier of Russia had been assassinated by, someone with American sympathies, and then within 24 hours had been assassinated by, a patriotic Russian? I think it would be clear that we would all understand that a change of power had taken place and that there had been, in essence, a revolution. And I think the same thing is true over those series of assassinations. It's a really good point that if we were talking about Russia and there was a 20-year period in which there are all these political activists who were opposed to the Politburo, who all had, were very prominent people, and they were all assassinated, we would say that it was a purge. That's what we would say. We would say that a purge occurred over this period. But in fact, we don't say that in the United States, and because we're us and they're